Welcome to Unregulated Leadership. We are three William James doctoral candidates. I am one of your hosts, Ashley Parrish, with Lavonya Douglas and Latoya Johnson. And our guest host today is Paul Coppola, talking to us about burnout.
And we're all in.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, how are you all doing?
We're doing fabulous. How are you?
Good, thank you.
I'm loving
Good
that
to be here.
in the background.
Well, thank you. It gives you a little sense of relaxation, right?
It does. I feel like I'm going on a long walk.
Yeah, I feel like I'm not burnt out anymore. I'm just like, I just need that picture.
You
Just
identified an intervention.
Yes. Just walk down that path in Paul's office, okay? So, Paul, we like to ask all of our guests how they found their way to William James. So we've got some interesting stories amongst the hosts. Lavonya is probably being the most interesting, but share with us how you found William James and why you chose the leadership psychology program.
Sure. I don't know that my story will be quite as interesting as Lavonya's, but I will
no one
say
ever is, Paul. No one ever is.
That's a high bar to set. For me, it's funny when I looked at my entire career, it's always been about behavior. It didn't matter. And it took me a long time to actually figure that out, that I've been in the healthcare space for 20 years. And when I thought about what I've done, I always wondered why I was always listening to people and talking to people, understanding what some of the issues they might be going through. Even if I was on a plane, all of a sudden I started having these conversations. And the next thing I knew, I realized that my career has really been committed to behavior. And regardless if it was an employee in our company, or it was one of the members that we served, or a provider, or just understanding why people were going through certain things, it always came back down to behavior. So to me, that's been an area that I've been completely fascinated by. And as I was looking through, and I'll tell you just a quick story, and I joke about the plane, but it's actually very true. No matter where I am, when I've been on a plane, and my wife will always tell you, I'll talk to anybody. But I was on a flight, and it was actually a longer flight. And there was a gentleman from the military, and he was actually there was actually a really active child on the plane that was creating a lot of stress for everybody. And we were talking, and I could tell he was getting agitated, and he was getting severely agitated. And what was happening as he was going through this experience was that it was actually a big trigger for him. And he started tapping. And so I had actually understood tapping because I had done a little bit of research on it at one point. And what I was learning about him was that he had gone through post-traumatic stress disorder, and he was living it firsthand. And he was having a really tough time on that flight. And as I was sitting there during that whole experience, and we were talking, and again, and it's a lot, right? You're having a long flight. There's no downtime. When we got off that plane, he said, "You saved me." And I didn't even know how to take that. But that was just a moment to me that it was a really powerful tool to be able to listen, to be yourself, to just be part of something, to understand, and just know that you made a difference. And candidly, that's how I ended up at William James, because I was really looking for a path that brought me, that I knew I could make a bigger difference, something bigger than just being in one organization or just doing one thing, but really thinking about that bigger picture. And for me, because it was really tied to behavior, I really wanted a program that was really focused on people and community. And, I looked at a lot of different programs, but William James for me, it came together. It just really, that whole sense of belonging.
You know what? I think we need to create
over Lavonya.
Of why, why William James. That was an amazing story, right? Because based off of what happened in your just regular everyday life, like, you're like, I want to go and be somewhere where I can affect more change in this behavior space because of the impact that you had already made. Like, that is like so amazing. I love that.
And you don't even realize it's happening when you're in the middle of it, right? And it's just sometimes that, and a lot of times you never get that kind of feedback. And that was like a gift at that moment, but it really solidified the path.
I love that.
And I think go ahead, Latoya.
I was just going to say that I think Paul highlighted something about the William James program and about, leadership psychology in general, is that usually when people think about a doctorate, they think about you going from big down to something very small, right? And you just so aptly articulated how humans, right, are everywhere, and human behavior shows up in every system. And so you don't necessarily get pigeonholed into one space or place. And it's really about trying to understand how all of the moving pieces are working and how they interact. And that definitely resonates. I get that 100%.
It's a great point, Latoya. And you think about the space that we're in and the people that we're touching. We're looking at organizations, we're looking at these bigger systems, and there's people, right? And all of that, and the needs look very different. It doesn't necessarily, it's never a one size fits all. There's a lot of theory that impacts what we do, but at the end of it, it's about bringing that together to be able to understand the unique needs that are appearing for people and in those systems, and what can you do to help them. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. Paul, what exactly did you do to was it just talking with him while he was tapping? What advice would you have for someone that was in that same situation?
Yeah, it's interesting. So it all started because I made eye contact, right? And that's always where it starts. You just make eye contact and a smile, and the next thing you know, you've just opened the door. But it started because part of it was just reading and sensing something was going on, and I wasn't asking a lot of questions. I was just listening, and I was not in a position, nor would have been my place, especially just meeting somebody for the first time like that, to start asking. But I could tell that there was an agitation, and I could just see body positioning. I could see just natural movements and things that were happening, and almost just like a sense of discomfort. But a lot of it was, I was just, you couldn't help but observe, when you see simple tapping, it's just your fingers, right? And it's just a very simple practice. And it actually is done a lot in the military. And I don't know, Ashley, if you've seen that in the military, where they're actually, but it's just really kind of a simple, they start creating a pattern. And pattern is a start of cope, because what you can do is start to take yourself, and you think about how our brains work, right? We've got that massive stress, which is our amygdalas firing at full force. And what you're doing is you're really bypassing that. You're just taking and you're starting to get your frontal lobes opened a little bit, not to get too neuroscience around this, but you start to calm it down, and tapping starts to create that pattern of relaxation so that you can be more centered. And it is almost like a practice of mindfulness. And so it was really powerful, but I could just kind of watch his fingers, and and just by listening and just hearing what he was saying and just acknowledging some of those things, it took him from what I could tell was a pretty heightened level of stress. And that was over a multi-hour period, because this was a long flight across the country. And what we were just having some dialogue around, and some of the things that he had experienced, and little by little, he just was opening up. But for him, that was the release. He just needed someone to be listening to him and just, not push him away. At the same time, he was trying to shut down all the other distractions and the noise that he was facing.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's really good advice. Latoya, did you have any other opening questions, or did you want me to dive in?
So I think our only other question is about leadership and how it's been a part of your life. You talked about being in the healthcare space, and how have you evolved as a leader to this point?
Yeah. I've actually been leading people, back for over 20 years. It's interesting because I found myself in individual contributor roles over the years, and somehow, without even really planning it, I end up back in a leadership role. And, I've always said, leadership is not, of course, being a people manager all the time, right? It's just being a leader, being able to model your behaviors, being able to help others and support them. But what I've also found is that throughout my career, and even prior to my career, even in school, it's just, I've naturally gravitated toward it. There's just been a natural interest, but a lot of it just comes down to being very purpose and very passion driven to help and make a difference. And so with those, I tend to find myself in those spaces that I really enjoy being able to help to influence, versus waiting to find out what the outcome is going to be, but help to actually set that in motion.
Oh, we'll say cream rises to the top. So it just makes sense that you just keep elevating. That's awesome.
Love that.
I'm not surprised, Paul. I see your discussion posts, and they always set the standard. Because I'm not gonna lie, I always since day one, and Lavonya knows exactly what I'm talking about. I'll be I'll do my 250 word count. I'm oh man, this is all I got. And I look at Paul and I'm like, look at Paul's post. I'm like, okay, back at it. I can do more.
And they're always so deep. They're always so deep and thoughtful. And I'll be like, okay, I can't. It's almost like this bar that he set. It was like,
and they're cited properly.
All the
now
time.
I am gonna blush all the way through, but it's the power of we that makes this impactful. It's not.
Stop it, Paul. Stop.
No, I can't take it. It's the power of we.
Stop it. There's no we when you're doing your discussion post.
It's all him, right? But he also, I know this is about your, doc project, but I have to, like, Paul is like I feel like he's like the class president. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like he is we need to do superlatives before we graduate. And, I'm nominating Paul for class president because he is always so helpful. And then I will get to like internship class and 3 other people be like how he helped them with something. And I'd be like, but he helped me too. Like,
I know.
And he does it with he's patient and he's kind and he's helpful. And he's like, does this make sense? Like, let's walk. Like, he's like the best person, like,
yes,
in the world to be just here. Okay.
I know Paul says
impacts on planes, you have impacts in your class. I'm sure you have impacts at work, you have impacts in your family. Paul, you're just an amazing person, period.
That's right back, all of you, because remember, we all said we were going to get through the finish line together, and that's the power of the cohort. Like, that's the power of this whole group together, is the amazing thing that everybody helps each other, and they all bring that's the thing, is your strengths all rise in different ways, right? And that's the awesome thing, is that we all bring something different to the table to help each other to be better.
And with that, thank you for proving our point, Paul. We'll go to question number 1. So, how did the topic of being burnout, how did that start to get your serious attention? Mm-hmm. And then I guess like part 2 of the same question is that, like, was it your own personal burnout, or was it the burnout of other people? Like, what was it that got you like, okay, I really want to learn more about this topic?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question, Ashley, because I try to think, even before I had started, burnout to me was always a concern. And I didn't even know how big of a concern, but you can almost see it in society, because you think about, like, you're having a conversation with somebody and somebody's like, oh, I'm so burnt out. And I mean, in an average day, I may have 4 to 5 people that'll just tell me they're burnt out. And that to me is fascinating. And I don't know, across all of you, how many do you yourself, have you said it, or do you have others that have said it to you, just like in a regular conversation?
Definitely. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's scary because you hear that more and more. And again, let's just put the pandemic aside, because this topic has existed well before all of this had started. But even back, I mean, you could see it: technology, noise, distractions, things were pulling on people. And one of the bigger drivers is stress. And we know stress is, and there's a lot of underlying factors that I think that are not understood to the degree they are, but stress is definitely a big driver of it. My general concern with burnout, and one of the reasons why I became like just so passionate about it and I wanted to do more around it, was that I felt like if we don't do something as a society, we could just start to fall apart. And that happens with organizations, it happens with people. And for me, and there is a clinical definition, which is a really important one, which does start to talk about things like emotional fatigue. And so, people start to feel tired. And a lot of times what people are feeling when they say they're burnt out is just emotional fatigue. And that alone actually is not burnout. But if it keeps persisting, it can definitely drive. The other thing is that depersonalization, and that's really where people don't feel value. I'd say, and I'd argue that many people, not all, but most people are driven because of a purpose, and they're driven because they know they're going to impact something, or they want to feel valued. And depersonalization is a big struggle as well. And you do see that a lot, that people don't even think that their work is valuable to someone else. And that's, a question that I've done when I've been coaching with people is what's the one thing in your life that you would do for free because you love it so much? And how many people would say that about the job they're in? And I'm
not me. Sorry. Well, go ahead. Try to fire me. I'm military. Can't. Just kidding.
But no, there's number 3 is cynicism. And that's actually like this unwavering sarcasm. Now, I mean, I think we've all had that, where we use sarcasm and humor to get us through the day. But this unwavering cynicism, another component of it. But when those three come together, that actually defines burnout. So a lot of times you'll hear people say, I'm really burnt out, but they're really facing stress. And I think, part of where I was really focused on it was that I really wanted to, one, understand what are a lot more of the underlying drivers behind it, and what can we do about it? Because again, if we do nothing, I'm really concerned that as society, we will burn out. And so that's each of our obligation to help people to understand how do they make that path through.
Before we started recording, you were talking to me about that burnout may look different for people of color. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. Yeah. And that's an area that I'm really passionate about. And one thing that the research it's kind of mixed. There's not as much out there as we would like. And we're an area that I've been trying to do a lot more, especially in the last few months. But one thing that's found is that, we think about traditional stress being caused, and, the World Health Organization actually de-emphasized the clinical piece of burnout in 2019. And the reason they did that was because they were saying it's definitely an occupational driver. But they didn't. One thing that I think we've missed the opportunity to understand is what else is causing it for people, and particularly for people of color. There are issues that are related to racial incongruence, right? So somebody being in a job and not feeling like they're being valued the same way, or they might have to act and behave differently in a workplace because the standard might be different for them. And a lot of that comes because workplaces may not be as inclusive as they could be. Or perhaps different types of expectations are put on people of color. And there has been a fair amount of research that has shown this, that individuals, as they're going through an experience, they may be asked to take on, for example, some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion responsibilities that, and I acknowledge I'm a white male, right? I have as much responsibility to take that on as anyone else in the organization. I mean, I have the responsibility to be an ally, but a lot of times what's happening is when you look at how this type of work is being done, it's being pushed, and that's creating a burden on individuals, and it's not a fair burden. But that added stress actually is also creating levels of burnout. So the work that I'm doing is trying to better understand definitely how that's happening, and also for me, it's what can we do at an organizational level. You hear a lot especially in health and human services, in the clinical space, you hear a lot about burnout. In the corporate environment, though, it doesn't come up quite as often. Sometimes it might come up as resilience, which again is a much more positive way to think about how do you help to improve. But resilience alone doesn't address the fact that we are creating those shifts and burdens.
That was awesome. I'm just here like digesting it, and I wrote down, like, I'm actually taking notes like while you're talking, like I think like some things like the depersonalization, and I feel like I personally can totally relate. And then you like, I'm an ally. Like I really enjoyed that, like the word ally, because I guess like me from like a military perspective, like ally has a really heavy meaning to it. And because like it is a battle, and then especially since we're all becoming psychologists, people are dealing with internal battles, which is where burnout really is. And then to know like you have maybe even someone doesn't even understand or hasn't walked in your shoes, but to know like you're an ally, and that like I can give you psychological safety to be fully honest where you are right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I would love to interview the people that work for you. I'm sure they would be like, Paul's great. I could just see like that would be awesome. So if you have their phone numbers,
we're gonna have a follow-up
or they may go running the other direction.
No, I just really appreciate that you are looking at things from perspectives that you may not necessarily even have, but like if you're a human, everyone is dealing with a battle, and it sounds like you're acknowledging someone else's battle.
We have no right to take anyone's happiness or their voice or who they are and their identity away from them. We don't. None of us do. Mm-hmm. And that's the challenge, is that's what's happening. And I think that's not always understood. And we talk about how people have to change their voice or change their behavior or the way they show up, and what people have to actually do to feel congruent with other people in an organization. That doesn't feel fair. to me. And that's really where a lot of this is, you start to read and you start to research this more. And it does happen a lot more than we think. Even in organizations that are very inclusive, it still can be happening. And so that's part of where this work is coming from, is to really help to create an awareness for others, because of the fact that as we think about, the roles we all play, if leaders in organizations, we all have an ability to help to change this. And that's why leadership doesn't have to be a people management responsibility, right? We can all set the standard. We can all ask the question, was that an inclusive statement? Was that inclusive behavior? Are we thoughtful about how that might have impacted somebody else in what we said or what we might not have said? And that's really where we have to help to do that. And this is the time around education and awareness. We can't expect someone to educate us. We all have to step out in front of that to be able to learn and do.
So Paul, have you started having conversations with people about this? Or are you just in the beginning stages of like finding the research?
I've been doing some research. I am going to be starting to do some more focus groups as well. I have had some conversations, Lavonya, around it, and just starting to understand. It does show up differently. So it doesn't necessarily, I wouldn't say that it appears the same way for everybody. And I'm not sure everybody's comfortable talking about it the same way either. But just kind of preliminarily though, it's, just through dialogue and conversation, there's something there. And again, and it looks a little different too. And that's the thing is that it's not like we can say this is always going to look and feel the same way in every company or for every person. And what's interesting is there's been some data too, even just for people of color, where burnout actually proceeds. A lot of times the traditional stressors actually are not actually presenting. There was some work that was done around medical school students, and they were not experiencing, and they looked at Black versus white medical students, and the white medical students were actually burning out due to stress, the pressures. The Black medical students actually were not. But what they were burning out from was the fact that they were experiencing racism, or they were feeling inequitable in the school setting. And I thought that was really interesting and really telling. The fact that there's, over time, how we're each coping or dealing with different things. But the point is that that's where it's showing that there's some of that shift that's occurring.
It kind of makes sense in a way. I don't know what you think, Lavonya and Latoya, but it kind of makes sense to hear that they were enduring the stress better. And it kind of reminds me of like with Navy SEALs and what you hear when with retired Navy SEALs get interviewed. It's the people who do the best are the people who are actually the shortest guys, the smallest guys, because they're so used to being told you can't do this. Mm-hmm. And the same thing I've also heard with like artists, that people that you would think like artists are maybe more emotional. My brother's a professional artist and he's pretty emotional. So I would think like those folks maybe not be the most resilient, but basically kind of like connection to what you're saying is that when you're so used to being scrutinized for your art or scrutinized for your appearance, it's stress is stress sometimes according to the body, depending on the person, of course. So it makes sense that the Black students were able to endure it. Makes sense maybe that the stress from home or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's important, and so experience is a big driver of all of that, right? But at the same time, that's also should be a wake-up call for us too, right? That the fact is that people are experiencing this, and while that just starts to talk to how things are happening in these different environments and how things are getting really spread across or pushed against people, that it just doesn't seem fair. And so it is a really big deal, actually. And to your point, I mean, I think there's a whole level of intersectionality, and I think, Lavonya, your question was getting there too, is this whole element of intersectionality where people don't necessarily feel comfortable bringing their identity forward, right? And in some parts of our identity are very physical, so people make assumptions based on what they see. But then there's this whole other level of our identity that's below the surface that people don't even know, that people don't feel comfortable sharing either. And that's because they don't feel safe in the environment to be able to do that. But having to hold on to that creates stress for people. And
Mhm.
that's where you don't feel like you can talk about your identity, or you don't feel like you can share parts of yourself because of that. And that's exactly where this work is going. It's about this kind of exaggeration of your life that you sometimes you're feeling like you're living different lives and you really can't be yourself. We know that people who can be themselves fully are, they are happier, right? They do bring more. They're not dealing with some of the physical, emotional, and mental experiences that others that have to hold that back are. And there has been a lot of research too, just even with, where people are experiencing hardships in their own life, like how that actually physically weighs on them long term, and where they're starting to experience health issues and other things. So it is very real. And again, it's not always, people don't always, they're not always aware of it. And so that's where it's awareness is like almost, in self-reflection are our first steps in the process.
I think you are focusing on burnout, but what you're doing and talking about is going to open up like something even bigger, right? You're talking about people being comfortable with themselves, people being able to be who they authentically are and show up every day. So while the conversation is focused on burnout, people are going to learn how to be authentically themselves. People are going to learn how to, it's okay to show up in this space. You're going to show other people how to help other people be psychologically safe in whatever space that is, even if it's not just burnout. Like, as I hear you talking, this is major. This is not something small, and it's not something that I think we've talked about enough and appreciated people's differences, right? And so this is going to be massive.
It makes me, what Lavonya's like, this is like major. It makes me think of that quote. It's like my favorite quote. And it goes, it's not the load that breaks you, it's the way you carry it. And I think that we're all like, I feel like the first wave was just to admit that this load is breaking us, just to get us to that point where we can say mental health matters, the way that we're carrying, like the load is breaking us. Okay, step one, we got people to admit that they're being broken. And I feel like you're taking it back now, being like, okay, the way that you're carrying it. It's not just the fact that you're broken, we got that, but it's the way that you're carrying it. And then once you get people to understand that they've, not saying you did it to yourself, but in some ways, especially when people won't come forward with what they're struggling with, it's just like it helps people to see like, oh, I'm not a victim. Like I can be my own solution, and I can prevent myself from getting more broke and more burnt out. Wow, I'm so excited.
Yeah. And I think and I just want to point out, first, I love the quote that you just said, Ashley. So I'll just got duly noted on that. But I'd say the other part of it is too that we all have to realize our own actions, right? And I own my own actions personally, and I think this is kind of a message there for many of us is are we aware of what we might be doing though that might also be contributing to that problem? So I agree with you, like what people can take, but I also think that there's a part of this that I really want to make sure is coming through, is that we have to realize how our own actions might affect somebody else too. And I think sometimes it's, people think, oh, I'm always being equitable, or I'm always thinking about and being inclusive. And yet the language they might use may not feel that way at all. In fact, they're making others, because they're not leaning in with curiosity, and they're not leaning in to try to understand the intent. Sometimes what they're doing is they're actually causing people not to feel safe, to your point. And that's a really big deal. And I think so some of it starts with us, each of us is just recognizing that action, and then building, in Lavonya, to your point earlier, it just kind of brings it together as a connection. And so we have to realize, but yes, some of it is on each of us, and some of us, there's more we can each do to be aware and make sure that we're not also causing, and pushing that on someone else too. So.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys seen The Office, the TV show, The Office. And there you have Michael Scott. I love The Office. And Michael Scott tries to do Diversity Day, and he tries to do like all this stuff. It just try to be like more inclusive. And all he does is just do the exact opposite. And he reminds me of these people who are who are considered the lovable fools. They literally are trying to be inclusive and diverse and make people feel welcome, but in their efforts to do so, because your execution style is everything, they just do the exact opposite. So it makes me think of like, yeah, there's a lot of lovable fools out there that they really do care, but my goodness, are they just terrible at showing it. And so you talked a little bit about it, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like the differences of different types of burnout. So like, burnout from work, burnout from daily responsibilities. And then I liked how you said like the depersonalization in jobs. So it's like burnout from the job you hate versus burnout from a job you love. And I was kind of hoping that when you say burnout, like I want people to be able that who do actually relate, know that they relate. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And it's interesting because burnout really has to meet all three of the criteria that we talk about. So it really does have to kind of tie, because it's interesting when people will talk about burnout, sometimes, their first attempt will be, I'm burnt out from my job, right? So you just say that out loud and you're like, oh, I need to get out of this situation. And they do. And they go somewhere else and they'll do something, whether it's changing companies, it might even just be changing roles, it might even be changing managers, whatever that driver is. But what's interesting is in a few months, what people start to notice is the unhappiness comes back, the depersonalization comes back, the cynicisms might be right around the corner, the emotional fatigue definitely comes back, and it doesn't go away. And what's happening is that they didn't really address what the underlying factors were. And so burnout really is that combination of the three. And now it can be driven, like I said, stress is a major driver of burnout. And it's not just stress, because I think we all are trained and we're equipped to deal with stress, and we deal with it differently. But I think the other side of stress that we have to realize is it's the chronic nature of it. It's the constant pressure. Sometimes we blame others, right? We blame the environments. This place is just, there's too many meetings, there's too many issues, I've always got this problem, or people don't really care about work-life balance. You hear all of those factors with burnout sometimes. And but that gets back to the earlier points that you had made, was that's where we have to learn to control some of that ourselves, that we personally have to own. Work-life balance is a really tough thing, and not to go too far on that path, but work-life balance is a really tricky thing for people, because no one can actually give you work-life balance, because your personal life, right, is, if you think about work and you think about your personal life is made up of many different factors, whether you have a family that either lives with you, or you have relationships of some type that are in your life, whether, again, you might be a caregiver, you might be mental issues. When we talk about some of the things that I had mentioned earlier about like racial incongruence, you may deal with a lot of factors in your community that you carry with you every day. Those are all contributors, can be all contributors to burnout. The pandemic, I think, also showed us that, if you're in a work environment that you're not comfortable with, right? Meaning you had to work from home full time and you weren't accustomed to that, if that happened to be your situation, or you had to go in because your role required you to physically be there, those were also contributors. And those might not be direct workplace drivers, right? So there's personal factors of it. And then there's this whole professional side of it. Some of that we can control, and some of it you can never turn that off. Your personal life, as much as we'd like to, I mean, you can say, no, I'm not going to do this today, but there's a lot that we're all dealing with that we can't just shut off because it's there every day. So what we have to realize is those are the compounding factors that get to your question, which is burnout can happen many different ways because it all starts to build up. And while it might show up in the workplace, there might be some other factors outside of the workplace that actually are driving. And that's part of where this broader examination of burnout becomes really important, that it's not always just because you had to do this large project and you felt like, there wasn't that work-life balance in there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
You said no one can give you work-life balance. That's going on a t-shirt, okay? On a t-shirt, that's going on a cup somewhere.
On a magnet.
Listen, because that is because everyone, like, we come to work, but like, y'all need to, they're expecting their jobs to give them this work-life balance, right? Like, you didn't do this, or you didn't allow me to do this, so that's why I don't have work-life balance, right? But by you saying, like, you give it to yourself, because everyone's personal and work and what they bring and what their responsibilities are all individual, it puts the responsibility back on the person to figure out how to give it to yourself. And that, I'm going to add that to my notes of t-shirts that I have to make. Okay, because
I'll line right up for that one.
Yeah,
I'll be the first
great.
one.
Paul, I wanted to ask, you gave us the 3 criteria that equal burnout, and I'm wondering, based off what you are learning about burnout, are the numbers higher in different industries? You quoted the medical school study, and I can imagine, not that everyone's life and work isn't valuable, purposeful, and meaningful to our collective society, but I think the implications or potential consequences are slightly higher in some industries than others, right? If I'm going to the ER, I don't want a doctor that's
right.
At burnout stage, but I might be okay with a Staples employee, right? So I'm wondering if there are industries that you're seeing higher numbers of burnout in.
Yeah, thanks, Latoya, for that. And that's an important one. And it's interesting because I would say that the industries that, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples as well, but the industries that it tends to resonate the most are the ones that you have some type of caregiving or some type of compassion fatigue. And then we have to translate that, because I think sometimes we think of caregiving in the truest sense of what caregiving is defined as, but many roles play the role of a caregiver. And I'll give you an example. So education, Latoya, I know you're in education and you're dealing with higher ed.
Yeah.
It's in Lavonya, you're dealing in public service, right? In different ways, you're working with the police force, right? You're doing training and building. Ashley, you're in the military, working with the military. All 3 of those are very high intense types of public service. They're caring for something, right? There is a level of caregiving that is occurring with that. So in the clinical field, very traditional space that you might expect, especially with the mental health practice, or whether it's some type of medical, care delivery, that definitely plays. Public service is absolutely very, whether it's related to the police force or other, first responders, it can be very high. But then also you do see it with teachers. You do see it with, you see it really where there's a touch. The service industry as well. So it's interesting you mentioned Staples as an example, but there's been a lot of research to show that in service industries, that there is actually, especially in like frontline, you're working with customers, you're experiencing, you unfortunately are a representative of that brand. At the same time, you are also a recipient of everything that customer is feeling at the time. So if if the customer is happy with you, you personally take that in. But at the same time, if that customer has experienced something that is, that makes them really unhappy, you're also taking that in, and you pick up that burden in that shift too. So the service industry is another really big area that has played in. It's interesting because there's less studies to show the corporate environment, which is actually, to me, is fascinating, because the Fortune 500 is, there's a level of intensity that comes, but I think because they're sometimes privately held, they don't necessarily show up the same way in the studies as some of the public roles.
That's a great point. What I hear you saying is that no matter the industry, whether that be, human services, retail, hospitality, whatever, it sounds to me like those industries, those people in positions in which they can have those interactions in which there is that transference of just like emotion and potentially it's transactional, but a little bit more than that feels. I know for myself and for lots and lots of my colleagues in higher education, it is real. Burnout is real, particularly for my colleagues who work in residence life and have students living on campuses, and that was true before COVID. It is even more so now as they try and navigate, having, communal living with a very highly contagious virus. So, yeah, 100%.
And it is because you're really, with a traditional caregiver, especially, and again, because it's such a broad touch, you're putting your own needs after somebody else's, right? And that's the role, whether you're, regardless of where you may find yourself, you're postponing you. And that's just a very natural sign of being a caregiver. You're doing something for somebody else to make sure that they're better off at the end, which is, it truly is noble. But at the same time, what sometimes people forget is by doing that, they stop taking care of themselves. And so you're not helping somebody else if you yourself are no longer equipped to do that. And so that's the hardest part. It isn't being selfish to make sure you're taking care of yourself too, but because of being a caregiver, it can create, and sometimes I think we've all experienced this. Sometimes you feel like emotionally you're giving and giving and giving, and you're becoming, and especially like when you look in the clinical profession, people are getting very emotionally tied to the people they're caring for. And that happens in education as well, right? Especially when you see students that need additional support, and you start to become emotionally drained, which starts to lead to that emotional fatigue.
Absolutely. You mentioned work-life balance, and I'm going to take this opportunity to maybe pivot a little bit and ask, when we think about trying to recover / cope with burnout, what are some possibilities for those folks who find themselves there but want better, want more? And for some of us, we have the privilege of having our work life blended, right? You have great opportunities to work from home, or maybe even take your children with you to work, or whatever the case may be. But everyone doesn't have that opportunity. So I'm wondering what people can do to kind of cope or I would say maybe recharge a little there.
Sure. No, it's an important question. And it's a tough answer in the fact that it's not one answer that always will work. I wish I could say that it could always be the same practice or the same initiative. And there are things like mindfulness you can do to help to recenter and to be able to give yourself some focus. But I would say step one is really around working to try to understand what might be causing it. And part of that understanding might require you to be able to separate. I do joke about this a lot with people, but if you could just walk on the beach and just take a nice walk along the water, and you could disconnect from life and you could just focus and start to understand what's actually causing some of the things you're dealing with, because sometimes it could be a lack of happiness, right? And that's a lack of fulfillment. And so there really mindfulness practice, even, and I'm using that as the one example at this moment, but that alone isn't going to fix the problem. If you're finding that you're not feeling like you have a real purpose in what you do, and you just feel like you're going through the motions, that's a slightly different way to address that. But you have to be able to disconnect yourself from that environment. You have to find out what's causing. And so one of the recommendations that I would make to people is give yourself a chance to step back a little bit. And I'm not saying you're taking months and years to do this, but what it is doing is take yourself out of the environment and see how your emotion might change and how your needs may you might start to see some shifts. So if you found yourself, let's just say you're not going to work, let's say you're going to take 3 days for yourself for a vacation day, and you're not going to check in. You're not going to allow calls to come to you. You're just going to truly separate yourself. Notice what's different about your mood, your emotion, attitude, and see if that makes a difference. If it doesn't change, I'm not saying that it's a one size fits all, but there could be something else there. But if you're finding that suddenly you feel lighter and you feel like, oh, maybe this is it, or try doing things that give you joy and find that point in your life. Because I think a lot of times, back to the caregiver example, but a lot of times we postpone our own happiness for others. And what happens is, and Brene Brown is phenomenal for this, but she goes to the importance of finding joy in your life, right? Finding that purpose, valuing, back to your authenticity. What gives you that happiness? We started the conversation earlier today too, just thinking about, if you could do one thing in your life that you would just do for free because you love it so much, and it doesn't look like what you're doing right now, that might help you to start to navigate. And I know when I've done career coaching with people too, that's a question that I will ask them. And we spend a lot of time trying to reflect. We kind of do that whole journey of your life and how you got here. And you start to look at the points, where were you happier, or what was happening, and seeing what's driving that. That to me helps you to get a little bit deeper to what might be causing the burnout. Because even if you took hey, if you could go on a 3-week vacation to your favorite place, if that's all you need to recharge, that's great. But sometimes there's something else there, and sometimes you just need something else, or you just need to be surrounded by people that you care about, or you might find that you do something to give back to somebody else. Like if you love to volunteer and you find that you re-energize that way. So I think part of it is knowing you and reflecting on you, realizing where you're finding that happiness and where it brings you joy, and then stepping out of that and doing something with that. And I think that to me is where the beginning, because I think sometimes we go right to the resilience program. And, I'm sure we've all probably said at one point, we treat the symptom, not the problem. And a lot of times what we're doing with, and I'm not saying resilience programs are phenomenal, so please don't take this anything for anything more than just, but sometimes we're only treating the symptom. Like, I'm tired, I need to sleep more. Okay. And that might be a case. You might just need to sleep more. As graduate students, I think that's probably something we've all failed at doing, especially in the last few years. Sleeping more is not necessarily an option right now, right? But for anybody, sleeping more doesn't necessarily solve the problem. That might be one way, because we're more overwhelmed sometimes when we're exhausted and fatigued. But what it is what else might be causing it? And I think getting there will help to sometimes address it.
Thanks.
Yeah, Paul, that pretty much answered the next question, to bring it into a close, but it was like, what can people do to prevent burnout, and then how can people recover? And it sounds like, I really liked what you said about volunteering, and I was just actually thinking about that myself. And everything with COVID, and now I live in Germany, so I was just thinking, I'm like where can I volunteer around here? I'm like, with people that speak English, because I really took it for granted that in the US I could just volunteer almost anywhere and it not be an issue. And now I'm just like, well, how do I do this? And how, just anything from just even getting my hair done. They don't, like some places only accept certain types of a currency, not cash, not euro, not like, and you have to have like a German bank card to be able to go to some of these places. And I'm like, wow, I didn't even realize that. So really, it made me realize like some of those things that like help me, like some self-care and some volunteering. It makes me realize, okay, like now, okay, I got my excuses of why I haven't been able to volunteer, but it's like, okay, now it's just like, but there are English speaking volunteer stuff. So it makes me realize, okay, I do need to prioritize these things I want to do. So it's not like things I want to do are really things I actually need to do.
Right.
So I appreciate you highlighting that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have to look at your environment and see what might be contributing towards it. And that's an important factor too. If there's other things going on in your environment, things that might be happening or things you're personally experiencing that may be causing that too, you have to be aware of that, because those are some of the things that you have to say. You may not be able to control them and you may not be able to shut them off, but can you change the environment in some way too to help you? So yeah, I agree. I think each of us has, as you look at that, and it's okay to give yourself a little bit of that space, and it's okay to be happy. I think we all kind of forget that. It's okay. It really is. It's not a bad thing. And especially where we want to help others and we want to take care of others, or we want to do that. But that's part of us. It's just, we have to also start to get back to that place, because that is going to be something, life isn't going to get easier, right? There's always going to be new complexities, and there's things going on in our political systems around the world. There's things going on in, country to country, right? There's a lot happening out there, and that is something we carry with us. And those are only a couple of examples. There's a lot of things we carry with us, but again, you can't control what you can't always control. So how can you balance that too?
Sure. Latoya, Lavonya, do you guys have anything before we let Paul give his final words of wisdom?
Well, I think what you're doing is awesome. I think you even putting yourself in positions that could possibly be uncomfortable speaks volumes to who you are as a person and the impact that you'll have on people, and people seeing you will make them comfortable doing the same thing. It's like, if Paul can do it, okay, so can I. Right? Sometimes people avoid certain things, but when they see someone else doing it, it gives them the strength to be like, okay, let me address this in my organization. Let me, he dealt with the pushback, he dealt with the uncomfortability. I can do it too. So I encourage you. I think it's gonna be great. We're here to support you, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. It has been a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I appreciate all of your thoughtful questions, and I appreciate the discussion today too. And it's important not to sit on the sidelines. It's important not to be the one to say, well, someone else will deal or fix this, or we all have it in us. It's just how we embrace it and we take it forward. Sometimes I think we underestimate how much we can do because, fear gets in the way, or to your points around discomfort. I mean, embrace that discomfort, right? And I think it takes, if nothing else, just do one thing. And then do another thing, and it gets a little bit easier. And you're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. It just happens naturally, but usually we can figure out a way to work through the mistake and learn from it and then continue. So,
yeah. Well, with that, Paul, do you have any final words? I mean, this was awesome. This was so great. And I just really appreciate that you took a topic that seems that people could be even burned out from talking about burnout.
Right.
And you just brought new life to it and perspective. And I'm just like, wow, I can't wait for your book. I'm going to give it to everyone for Christmas. So you have about 9-10 months to get it done. So
no problem. No problem. I'll get it ready. It'll be out in a few weeks.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, I always get nervous when I do the intro. Okay. Let me. Okay, make sure my ponytail's looking good.